This video is going to focus on just some of the common examples that we get of proteins. Now, this video is probably going to come a bit redundant to you later on because we're going to go through several. We're going to go through enzymes and antibodies, and we used to go through hormones, all sorts of things. But just as an introduction to it, I want you to understand the complexity of proteins. So we said previously in the proteome video that 20 to 20,000 genes make over 1 million different types of proteins. But what are all those proteins? And what we're going to do is we're kind of try and put them into a few little categories based on their functions. This is what we call their functional diversity. So they don't have to necessarily look the same, but they generally fall into little categories and end up in those. So here are some of the categories that we get within proteins. So we've got these things called enzymes that we're going to come back and look at soon. We've got storage proteins. We've got immunological proteins. These ones are really, really important in Unit 4. Yeah, these guys, you've probably heard a bit about them. Yeah, antibodies are immunological proteins. We've got transport proteins. You've already met them. They're the ones that are inside your cell membrane. You've got contractile and motor proteins. These are the ones that you might think of, muscles. We've got receptor proteins, structural proteins, and hormones as well. So let's have a look at just a few of these major categories. You can pause, you can go look at the actual PowerPoint and pull out the information, but there are blanks to fill in each one of these in your book. You don't need this much detail. All right, so I'm just going to get my highlighter to go through and show you what you might want to write down under the title enzyme. So the thing with an enzyme is these are the ones that act as catalysts in cellular reactions. I think that's probably all we really need in there. And if you want to, you could give a couple of examples. So here's an example here, is this one called lipase. Now, lipase's job is to break down large fat molecules into their constituent molecules, such as glycerol and fatty acids. You don't need to remember every specific example, but these are some examples of enzymes. In addition to that, they tend to finish in the suffix "ase." Yeah, suffix "ase." You've also got, so here's some other ones you might have heard of. We've got amylase. Now, we've got DNA and RNA polymerase. When we were talking about transcription, that means that it's actually catalyzed by one of these enzymes. So enzymes are super, super important in our body, but I will go back over enzymes in a future video. The next one we've got are hormones. So you go after just being through adolescence, still going through adolescence, you hear a lot about these things called hormones. So in humans, we've got heaps and heaps of different hormones that perform different functions. Their job is to coordinate activities within an organism. All right, so here's an example of insulin. So insulin's job is to remove sugar from our bloodstream and store it into our cells or store it into the liver in the form of glycogen. We've also got hormones like estrogen, progesterone. Well, females do, because they're the ones produced by our ovaries, and they're the ones making all the differences in our menstrual cycle and our secondary sex characteristics. There are heaps and heaps of different hormones. Not all of them are made of proteins, but some of them are made of proteins. So that's another job that a protein can take in our body. This one we'll come back to in Unit 4. These are the immunological proteins. They protect against disease by recognizing foreign bodies. So they activate immune cells. So we've got two different types. There are ones that are signaling molecules. These are called cytokines. And there are ones that actually protect against disease. Antibodies are your best example. And the other one that you might want to write down is cytokines. Early on in the pandemic, there was a lot of talk about the fact that COVID was instigating a cytokine storm in people. And so what they're talking about there is just our bodies were overproducing these cytokines, and we'll come back in Unit 4 and see what impact that might have on our bodies. Contractile and motor proteins, these are the ones that make up muscles. Okay, so these ones are actin and myosin. Again, you're very unlikely to come across them in this study design. We don't really focus on muscle action. There's plenty of other things to do, but protein traditionally is associated with muscles. The meat, if you eat meat, that meat is actually made up of actin and myosin, all of these little fibers creating this muscle tissue. So what you're at, if you were to look down into what the meat is that you're eating, it would look a bit like this, with this actin and myosin. We've also got structural proteins. These are ones that essentially do a whole bunch of different structural components in the body. Things like collagen in our skin to keep it nice and firm, keratin in our hair. Actin is one of the ones out of the muscles, and our cytoskeleton. So every single cell has a cytoskeleton in it, and that is made of proteins. We've got transport proteins. You've come across these when you've done your plasma membrane revision. So transport proteins, membrane channel proteins like carrier proteins or channel proteins that aid with facilitated diffusion and just active transport as well. So all of those are proteins. We've also got receptor proteins. So these are things like if you've done psychology, they're on the second neuron, and these are receptor molecules that take in so that neurotransmitters bind to in order to activate them. So they just assist the cell in responding to chemical stimuli. And the best example of these is the neurotransmitter receptors, or hormone receptors. Used to be pretty decent part of the old study design, but it seems like it's gone out of this year's study design. So I'm not going to focus too much on these. We can also have storage proteins. For example, albumin that's in an egg white. Casein as well, if you've heard of that, in milk. These are all ones, their job is to store amino acids to give us the building blocks to build our own proteins in protein synthesis. So they store amino acids. They also can store metal ions, but you're never going to be asked about storage protein. And so that is the end of a little kind of very quick tour of the functional diversity of proteins. You can see that they do so many functions that it's really hard to see how we could possibly function without the action of proteins in the body.